we are going to be diving in to the relationship between the Pentagon, private military contractors, and the retired military officers hired to advance their war efforts. If, when, where, how, and why foreign wars and domestic counteroperations are waged are not only determined by decision makers within the military, but by private military contractors and retired military officers that serve dual roles as defense advisors and service providers. An obvious conflict of interest by those standing to gain the most from perpetual conflict and an exponentially expanding U.S. defense budget. Because we have to ask ourselves, who stands to monetarily benefit the most from domestic political instability? Well, it's the same ones who have historically benefited the most from foreign political instability. The private military contractors brought in to conduct operations and counter-operations to quell political instability. You may know this as the International War on Terror, now of the largest industries in the world, encompassing counter-violent extremism, CVE, counterinsurgency, COIN, and counter-terror. All counter-operations utilizing the military's Field Manual 3-24, essentially making all counter-operations counterinsurgency operations. This is a private public industry that only conducts armed conflict 20% of the time, with the other 80% being waged through politics, using psyops, cognitive operations, and other forms of mutual or military operations other than war. And some of the same retired military officers caught inciting a thirst for war in U.S. citizens on behalf of military contractors and their counterinsurgency contracts in the Middle East were also coincidentally some of the same faces that did so to encourage what defense advisors of today have also deemed an insurgency within the U.S. This yet again prompting counter-operation contracts spurred on by some of these same retired military officers that have yet again benefited private military contractors, which now conduct these counter-operations domestically. Counter-operations that, just like those conducted in the Middle Eastern wars, may not have been possible without propaganda disseminated from some of these same, quote, retired military officers, along with, quote, ex-intelligence and, quote, ex-State Department officials. Some could argue that because of these, quote, ex-officers, the market size and where these counter-operations were previously conducted has nearly doubled to now include domestic audiences. This has, by default, exponentially increased the defense budget since 2013, when these domestic operations began, to first counter-violent extremism and now counterinsurgency. So, who are these, quote, ex-officials that have scratched the backs of the military-industrial complex over the years by inciting a thirst for war among U.S. citizens for the procurement of these counter-operation contracts? Well, there are quite a few.